I'm here to talk to you all about the Edgecombe County Parlor here at the museum. The parlor is notable for its beautifully constructed finish work, particularly the wainscoting, the paneled mantel, and the elaborate crown molding that you can see up there. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd like to take a closer look at these. So, right here we've got one of the window sashes. They are 9/6, which from a classical perspective drives me crazy because smaller things should be on top of bigger things, but this is something that I've been learning about North Carolina that is just different from Virginia, and that's fine. They're built in a Georgian style with very thick muntins and circular quarter rounds. Sash windows were very expensive. Clear glass was available only as an import when this house was built and carried an appropriately high price tag. Close to 90% of homes built in the Chesapeake were built without glass in this period. But this room has 3 on display. All right. Next here we have the wainscoting. All right. We're looking at some very well-constructed wainscoting. Each panel is raised and very precisely cut. Wainscoting is particularly tricky when you are trying to line up the edge of the raised panel with the bevel that you cut right there and have it point perfectly into the corner where the pieces of the frame meet. It's not a very fun process, but these have been built exceptionally well. On top of that, the moldings of the frame have been very carefully coped. If you can see right here where that piece comes up over the other one, that is called a cope right there. Some woodworkers will use a miter when they're doing this and have the 2 pieces meet at a 45-degree angle. That's a fine way of doing it, but the more refined and preferable method is to carefully cope the joint by removing a reflection of the molding from the vertical section of the frame. It's a delicate operation with a lot of room for error, but as the wood shrinks over time, the finished product looks a lot better than a simple miter. All right, on to our mantelpiece. All right. The mantel is likewise an exercise in frame and panel construction. The style is noticeably conservative, but I think that it's less a lack of refinement and more of a move towards the plain and neat style that will dominate architecture in the Federal period. It is painted using Prussian blue, which is a fashionable paint renowned for its expense. Of particular note to me are the curved panels. All right, when you're making a molding like this thumbnail right here, you can see that guy right there. On a straight section, you use a molding plane with a carefully shaped blade and the sole of the plane match so that when you push them along, it creates that profile for you. And they work great until you want to go around a curve, at which point you are now going to have to carve all of that. So yeah, all of this was carved with a very steady hand, which I'm again impressed by. The thumbnail arcs down from the center of the mantelpiece and is exceptionally clean. I'm thoroughly impressed by this. However, the only panels in the room that aren't raised are the panels in the curved section. As I mentioned, raised panels are hard enough, and trying to carve a curved panel is, it makes me wonder if perhaps the craftsmen hit a threshold that they were unwilling to cross. And then finally here, we're looking at the crown molding, all right? This is made up of 4 pieces. So we've got the cornice at the top, we have a fascia right here with the dentils sitting above it, and then we have our 2 little architraves right there. The dentils are a gorgeous addition to this crown molding. It's been painted with Spanish brown, which is, again, very fashionable. And the dentils represent a serious investment of time for a craftsman. Each dentil has to be hand-sawn and then chiseled out with the material in between. And I will mention, since they do hang very high up on a wall, there is a little bit of room for variation when you're cutting these out. Hopefully no jerk is going to get up on a stool with their phone and look very closely at these things like someone might have a couple days ago. But even then, considering that this is a place to let a little bit of organic work sneak in, these dentils are very well laid out and have remained crisp and even. Okay, so all of these architectural elements are very fine construction, and taken together represent a serious investment in refinement by the owner and skill by the builder. But what really fascinates me is the house that all of this came out of. So this is a watercolor of the house. Since it is currently wrapped in a protective layer of sheet metal, it's a small 2-room home with a gambrel roof, which surprised me. For those of you who don't know me and haven't seen me not dressed like this, this is what I normally look like, frowning at woodworking. Yeah, I have spent the last 5.5 years at Colonial Williamsburg studying and practicing 18th century woodworking, and very specifically architectural finish work. If it wasn't clear from all the things I just said, I have been living and breathing this for long enough that I have favorite tools that I talk to. They haven't talked back yet, but we're all waiting. It is my job to build rooms exactly like the parlor that we just examined. And that kind of decorative woodwork is reserved for an exceptionally wealthy planter elite who can afford to hire a workman to panel the interior of their home. And while this two-room home is finer than what the majority of North Carolinians can afford, the finish work exceeded my expectations for what the home should contain. So while the gambrel roof was popular in the period, this two-room design harkens back to a much older style of floor plan. When English colonists first began building more permanent homes here in North America, they brought their traditions with them. These included building a great hall, a large central space used for activities varying from meal preparation and a large fireplace to entertaining guests to everyday domestic chores. But as fashions changed, floor plans did too. Wealthy homes separated the various activities once performed in the center hall into different rooms. The hall was reduced in size and used as a passage to the various private rooms of the house. By the 1750s, these center hall homes were being built across North Carolina, but the Edgecombe County house wasn't built this way, even though it was constructed in the 1780s. Instead, the front door leads directly into the finely appointed parlor. This is a similar style of floor plan, and you can see right here where you walk right through that front door, and you're in the main living space right there. So that's, it is a bit of an anachronism, displaying high-end modern finish work in a space whose design hasn't kept up with the fashions of the time. And that led me to the question that I'd like to answer. Who were the folks who lived in this house, and what motivated them to put so much fashionable finish work into such an unfashionable home? Now, answering the first part of that question wasn't too hard. This parlor belonged to Frederick Jones, a Revolutionary War veteran and only son of a small plantation holder in Edgecombe County. He was born in 1754, he married Elizabeth Best in 1774, and when he died in 1808, he owned a lot of livestock, farmland, and he had enslaved 10 people on his farm. Unfortunately, this information alone doesn't paint a very vivid picture of the Jones family, but by studying Edgecombe County, in its largest town, Tarboro, built along the Tar River, we can put their family into perspective in the broader community. So, Tarboro was chartered as a town in 1760, although in the pre-war years it struggled to gain representation in the legislature due to its small size. This would not be the case for long. In the post-war years, Tarboro and Edgecombe County would experience a major growth in population. Demand increased for the goods easily produced in Edgecombe, namely naval stores. Those are going to be pitch tar and turpentine, but also tobacco and pork. Trade along the Tar River increased, and more areas of the countryside were opened up for cultivation. This newly cultivated land, combined with an influx of enslaved farm labor, made a lot of landowners very wealthy. As Reverend Francis Asbury, a traveling Methodist preacher, wrote of Tarboro in 1803, you can kind of pick up his tone here, "There are in this place about 33 families. The people have more trade than religion and more wealth than grace." Unfortunately for Reverend Asbury, wealth likes to be on display. And merchants in town were more than happy to sell wealthy planters silver vessels and silk waistcoats and the finest china money could buy. Some of these objects were imported, others required an influx of tradesmen. In 1810, 7 years later, Jeremiah Battle would write this of Tarboro: "There are about 50 private houses in it, and generally 15 to 20 stores, a church, a jail, tobacco warehouse, and a large courthouse. This place affords good encouragement to all industrious persons, particularly mechanics of almost every description. 60 or 70 mechanics have had full employment here at one time, but such of them as have emigrated to this place have too soon found themselves in prosperous situations and have betaken themselves to idleness and dissipation." These mechanics that Battle describes interest me, particularly the builders, for obvious reasons. But by the 1780s, I've discovered there were 15 carpenters operating in Edgecombe County. To put this into perspective, back in Williamsburg, where I work, there were only 12 carpenters operating over the 80-year period that was the capital city of Virginia. So Edgecombe has a giant building boom, and people are traveling there to find employment. They're finding employment building the infrastructure that the trade they're enjoying requires. That means smokehouses, it means dairies, it means slave quarters, it means barns. But wealth wants to be on display, and the plantation home is going to embody this desire. For the Jones family and others like them, the plantation home is an outward expression of their success. That's why fashion is so important in the construction of these homes. It gives us a lens into how each family wanted to be seen by the community. With that in mind, let's take a look at a home that is similar to the Joneses. So, this is Old Town Plantation. It was the home of Jacob Battle, a relative of Jeremiah Battle, and a member of 18th century North Carolina's most prominent families. The left-hand photo is of the house before it was moved and restored, but I really wanted to include this because it so prominently features what I'm pretty sure is the slave quarters. Most of my presentation leaves the institution of slavery in the background, but I wanted to take this moment to remember and acknowledge that these wealthy planting families made their money through bondage and misery. So, the style here is very similar to the Jones home, but has been built large enough to accommodate a central hall, a feature that we'll recall is absent from the Jones house. This difference is also reflected by their estates. There is a noticeable gap in between the two families, as you can see from the items I've pulled from their inventories. So here, I would also take a look and compare their parlors. So on your left, we have the restored Battle family parlor, and on the right, the Jones parlor here at the museum. The first thing that jumps out at me, unfortunately, is that the Battle parlor has lost its crown molding, which is a shame. I would have liked to have had that as a comparison here. There are other moldings that survive in the house that I could draw from, but if the Battle family followed convention, then the parlor should have had the finest. But what really sticks out to me the most is how similar these are. For families with what I would term a significant gap in their wealth, it's interesting to see that the Jones family putting so much of an emphasis on decorating their parlor. The houses were constructed around the same time, 1785 for the Battles, and sometime in the 1780s for the Joneses. I can't help but wonder if the Jones are signaling their aspirations to reach the same levels of wealth as the Battles. Go a long way to explaining their choice in architectural finish. There are two other estates that I would like to highlight. One is that of Thomas Deaver, a carpenter in Edgecombe County, and a friend to Jacob Battle. From court records, we know that Deaver was still taking on apprentices as late as 1799. When he passed away 6 years later in 1805, he reserved $700 to finish the home that he had already commissioned on his property. I think that's important. He's commissioned that home. He's not building it anymore. He has worked his way up out of his trade. So despite being a tradesman, Deaver is no different than the other well-to-do families in Edgecombe County, in that he's expressing his desire to construct a legacy for his family. It's noteworthy that as a tradesman, he's also worked his way into the upper levels of planter society. Jacob Battle is not only mentioned as a friend, but he's also one of the executors of Deaver's will. The other thing I want to look at from Deaver's will is a little clue to the social scene here in Tarboro, and that is his riding chair. I found a lot of riding chairs when I was going through inventories for Edgecombe County, and I found that kind of curious. Another person that had one was Jones' neighbor, Ezekiel Stanton. There we go. So at Stanton's death in 1815, he owned several small plantations and had enslaved 46 people on his properties. From the people that he enslaved alone, I consider his wealth on par with Jacob Battle's. And Stanton also has his riding chair. These weren't the only riding chairs that I found, and they point to a lifestyle that I think explains a lot about the Jones family. I had assumed that the Tar River was the main mode of transportation around Edgecombe County, until I looked closer and noticed the roads that crossed the region. In addition, Tarboro paid to have a 540-foot-long bridge built across the Tar River that would connect Tarboro with Princeville on the opposite side, and allow the folks living further out in the country easier access to Tarboro itself. These are people like Jacob Battle, Ezekiel Stanton, and Frederick Jones. All of these families were visiting each other using the roads that were built across the county, traveling back and forth in their riding chairs. Entertaining each other was a popular and important pastime, and despite not having the same level of wealth as the Battles or the Stantons, Frederick Jones had his home built to impress. The Reverend Asbury may have disapproved. Not even may. The Reverend Asbury certainly would have disapproved. But if Jones was going to host, he needed to have his home decorated as finely as they could afford. Despite the simplicity of their home's layout, they paid to have wainscoting run along the parlors of the wall, the walls of the parlor. They paid for sash windows. They paid for floor-to-ceiling mantel with that nice curved paneling. And they paid to have crown molding complete with dentils run all the way around their parlor. None of these items were built without forethought. Each of them were chosen to convey a message. To my eyes, this parlor is a promise. Frederick Jones has promised to himself and to his family and to every guest it visited that the wealth of his estate would rise to match the grandness embodied by his parlor. And I think that this answers my question. The Jones family built the house that they could afford at the time. They might not have had a fashionable center hall, but they didn't hesitate to dress their home in the finest work available. I see their parlor as an embodiment of ambition. Frederick Jones might have died in 1808, but the dream of building a dynasty didn't die with him. He divided his generational wealth, the land and the people that he enslaved, between his children, with the intent that this would increase their fortunes, that they would continue his legacy and the legacy of their family. And it worked. Allen Jones, Frederick's oldest son, inherited the property from his father. They weathered a terrible drought in 1810, but their interests were diverse enough that they survived. By 1850, Allen Jones had expanded his land holdings and had enslaved over 60 people. I'm unsure of how their family weathered the Civil War, but by the 1890s, this house was unoccupied. The family only referred to it as the Little House. They had moved on to bigger and better things that they had promised, and now the parlor sits here in the museum as a testament to their success. So, thank you.